Hello everyone, this is Remlace from 40k Theories, and welcome to the March 2019 edition of the Patreon Q&A sessions. As always, if you would like your questions answered, then click the link in the video description below and help support the channel by becoming a patron. Now, let's jump into the questions. Kaiba asks, what are your thoughts on the current Loyalist Primarchs that are currently in the Warp and how their extended time there could be affecting them? For example, Corvus Corax gaining the ability to become a monstrous shadow entity and a giant flock of ravens. Well, in regards to Leman Russ, I like to think that he's effectively turned into a giant wolfen. Corvus Corax, we know he's become a flock of ravens. I think that's it in regards to Loyalist Primarchs in the Warp. As for how it's affecting them mentally, it could eventually be driving them insane or turning them into more extreme or effectively caricatured versions of their personalities. Diego Flores asks, with the apparent release of Primaris Phase 2 of Shadowspear, do you foresee the Primaris Marines going to continue to the more specialised units like the Legions? I do see them getting more specialist units. As for them becoming more like the old Legions, that currently is still up in the air. I like to think that Guilliman's trying to implement some kind of hybridized ideal between the Legions and the Chapters to basically bring the best of both together into a new super organization, if that makes sense. Op6 Stabber asks, what would be the trade value of a Catachan barking toad? I suppose it depends who wants it. If it's a noble wanting it for their personal menagerie, it may not be worth as much compared to, say, a Magus Biologus wanting it for xenozoological studies or even biological weaponry. An intact specimen that hasn't blown itself up, I can imagine being worth quite a lot. How do souls work in Warhammer? How does destroying one work? Because I get the impression that only Catan and the Emperor were able to do that under very specific situations. In regards to the Catan, they didn't destroy souls, they just let them wander off essentially from their bodies. The soul is in essence the psychic reflection of a mortal being within warp space. Some races like the Eldari are able to retain their consciousness with their soul after death, whereas others are not psychically strong enough to do so. So yeah, to oversimplify, it's a living being's psychic echo. In regards to destroying a soul, bear in mind there is a difference between destroying a soul and driving a soul out of the body, with the latter being far more common. To effectively destroy a soul, you need to effectively destroy the echo completely. You can do this with either a strong enough concentration of pure psychic energy or if a demonic entity consumes and digests it, I imagine. I have a fun hypothesis that all of the 40k Codex factions each have their own ways to end planets, near Death Star style, even if it's just a mech boy accidentally deorbiting a moon. Is this true? What are the ways each of the main factions have for enacting an exterminatus, intentionally or not? For the Orcs, this could be something as simple as blowing up the planet. The Eldari, they have the ability to do so but tend not to do so, from what I recall, because they view themselves as not being barbaric and using such crude and violent methods to get what they want. As for the Tau, I'm not sure if they actually have anything like that yet. I could be wrong though. The Necrons have a few ways. They have that Celestial Ornery which can snuff out entire stars, I think. I think that's what it's called. I could be wrong, correct me in the comments. And they also have like weapons that have the power of a sun within them, so when they detonate it just goes boom. So I think most of the factions have their own Exterminatus class weaponry, but only a few of them actually choose to use them. Unfailing Eagle asks, could the Mechanicus belief in a machine god allow it to become its own chaos god or powerful warp entity? Theoretically, yes. We've already seen the beginnings of the god of the greater good of the Tau Empire, and we know that the Eldari gave birth to Slaanesh, so yeah, it's entirely feasible. Vral asks, what are your thoughts on Imbram Gaunt's new promotion, and how it affects the storyline of the Gaunt's Ghost series? I am very far behind on that, so I can't answer that, I'm afraid. I haven't actually read up to that point yet, I'm afraid. Sorry. Brandon A asks, what is the training like for guardsmen and women? Just how much are they put through? This really depends upon the planet in question. If the guard come from a feral world, then it could be something as simple as give them a gun, teach them to point it in the right direction, off you go, you're in the guard now, sunshine. Whereas the Cadians, for example, undergo some of the harshest training regimens imaginable for humans in general. So it really does depend on the world in question. Ulbrich asks, is there a faction of the Eldari who worship Slaanesh out of fear or a misguided belief that doing so will save their souls? I imagine so. I know the 2nd edition codex did mention that there were Eldari champions of Slaanesh, so yeah, it is certainly possible. Actually, if I recall correctly, I think that might have been touched upon briefly in the Jane Czar novel. I think. There was a cult in the webway who were called the Illuminated, I think? But off the top of my head, yeah, it's certainly possible. Zero Hits asks, I have a question regarding the Adepta Sororitas. I have noticed some inconsistencies regarding the descriptions of Battle Sister power armor. While the details of the power packs and the armor plating are usually consistent, the descriptions of the armor's inner workings are less so. In some descriptions, it's just a less sophisticated version of Space Marine power armor, it lacks a black carapace but still uses the fiber bundle musculature to give the armor its increased strength. In other descriptions, the armor is described as having a protective black bodysuit and using various small servos and hydraulics to grant the wearer the enhanced strength. Which is the correct description? Ooh. I think it's actually a combination of both, from what I recall. Like, the sisters will wear a body glove that has various interface nodes to connect themselves to the armor, even though they lack the black carapace themselves. So it's not a purely neurological connection, it's more like sensory receptor based through electrical impulses in the skin, for instance, I think, which in turn is transmitted to the armor, which is powered by a combination of fiber bundle musculature, servos and hydraulics. We know that it gives the sisters enhanced strength, that's why they're able to carry things like heavy bolters, heavy flamers, multi-melters without issue, whereas Imperial Guard will need two-man teams. So off the top of my head, I do believe it is a combination of the two. I know in one of the comics there was a female Inquisitor being fitted into Terminator armor, and she used a bodysuit which had various interface points upon it to help her interface with her armor. So I could be wrong because sisters aren't my strongest point of knowledge, I will admit that freely, but I do believe it is a combination of the two methods that you described earlier. Daniel Dixon asks, with the Blood Angels growing concerned over the severity of the Red First in Primaris Marines after the Coven incident, do you think that characters such as Dante and Corbulo will become Primaris Marines? In regards to Dante, absolutely, I think he will undergo the Primaris upgrade. Corbulo, yeah, I can see him undergoing it as well. With Mephiston gaining much of his power by overcoming the Black Rage, would becoming a Primaris Marine decrease his psychic might? I'm gonna hazard a guess and say no, because while the Primaris upgrade upgrades the body physically, much of Mephiston's power came through his sheer force of will, and I don't think you can change that through physical alteration. Brentfeast asks, is there anything that the Adeptus Mechanicus has that the Dark Mechanicus does not? I would assume that any of the more recently discovered STCs, the Dark Mechanicum would not have them, so things like, say, the Land Raider Crusader, or any of the Primaris weaponry, armor, vehicles, etc. By that same token, however, the Dark Mechanicus will also have things that the Adeptus Mechanicus will not, again, things like demon engines. So I think both sides have their own unique weapons, armor, vehicles, etc. Voice of the Emperor asks, could Glen Quagmire give Slaanesh a run for its money? No. Luke Welsh asks, what is your opinion on the Primarchs being made as counters or opposites to each other theory? I wouldn't necessarily say they were made as opposites or counters. If anything, they seem to have been made to complement each other because there are certain legions that have the same roles. So Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors, they're both siege specialists. It's just that one's better at holding a siege and one's better at breaking a siege. Raven Guard and Night Lords were both created as terror troops initially. Warhounds and Space Wolves, frontline shock assault. Wordbearers and Ultramarines more jack-of-all-trade types. So I don't think they were made as counters, I think they were actually made to complement each other. And finally, Kenneth asks, are the Eldari infertile, or have they just never managed to regain their numbers since the fall? They're not infertile, they just have an incredibly slow reproductive process. They need to mate in multiple stages, so when an Eldari female gets pregnant, the male needs to breed with her again and again and again to supplement more genetic material to the gestating fetus. As a result, it takes an incredibly long time for an Eldari to have a baby. This is why the Drukhari typically resort to vat growing and cloning to replenish their numbers. And that concludes this edition of the Patreon Q&A sessions. Again, if you would like your questions answered, then click the link in the video description below and help support the channel by becoming a patron. Until next time, this has been Remlace from 40k Theories, and we'll see you again soon. Bye bye.